With Kosovo's ethnic Albanians forced out of Serbian territory, NATO war planners found themselves with a freer hand to pursue their second objective, to attack the Serb armed forces and degrade their military capability. Over the last 3 weeks of the war, NATO intensified its bombing campaign against a new list of targets in Kosovo and Serbia, including water and power plants. Belgrade, the Serbian capital, went dark. At the same time, Milosevic's Russian allies began pressing him to yield control of Kosovo to the NATO alliance.
He realized that he had to capitulate or to risk suffering irreparable damage to his regime, to his military, and his power.
On June 10th, Milosevic agreed to pull his forces out of Kosovo and to allow ethnic Albanians to return to their homes. NATO's leaders credited the bombing campaign with forcing the Serbs' retreat.
Every single objective that was set out by NATO, in fact, has been achieved. Russia played a key role in helping to bring about the conclusion of this conflict. But the key to all of this was the unity of purpose that was demonstrated by NATO throughout the air campaign.
The air campaign did, in fact, accomplish the stated military objectives and ultimately the political objectives of both the U.S. and NATO.
As the air war drew to a close, NATO studied its own video footage, aerial and satellite photographs, and put together a picture of a stunning victory for air power. NATO claimed to have destroyed more than 120 tanks, 400 artillery pieces, and 200 armored personnel carriers. NATO also claimed to have caused between 5,000 and 10,000 Serb military casualties. But NATO peacekeepers, observing and counting the Serb forces withdrawing from Kosovo, spotted a disturbing trend. Light infantry, artillery, and armored units, which made up the vast majority of Serb forces, had been virtually immune to NATO attacks.
The forces they put in came out in the same number, and they looked as though they hadn't been beat up on for 78 days. They hadn't been damaged.
NATO observers reported that Serb forces appeared to be orderly and in good spirits, with nearly all of their vehicles, equipment, and personnel intact. Since then, NATO has dramatically scaled back its estimate of the damage done to Serb forces. After 78 days and 11,000 strike missions, in which 20,000 bombs and missiles were delivered, NATO may have destroyed or damaged fewer than 20 Serb tanks, along with a few dozen artillery pieces and armored personnel carriers.
So people now think that NATO airplanes didn't destroy nearly as many tanks, and that goes for it's the same for artillery pieces and armored personnel carriers and other types of heavy equipment like that, as they once thought. And the difference they think can be accounted for by decoys.
NATO's decision to avoid using ground troops in Kosovo allowed Serb forces to use a variety of techniques to divert and deceive NATO war planners. One such method was to build crude silhouettes of military vehicles, bridges, and even roads which look like the real thing in satellite photos and radar images. NATO pilots repeatedly bombed these decoys, believing each time that they had destroyed a military target.
And if you drive around Kosovo now, you see these things. I mean, they're oddities, curiosity pieces just sitting out in the fields. I mean, you'll be driving down the road and see what looks like a toy tanked from up close. But from the air, it just has the outline of a tank.
Serb forces were also able to deceive NATO's heat-seeking radars and missiles by placing large drums of liquid in the sunlight. After dark, as the liquid gave off its stored heat, it would divert missiles and radar away from nearby Serb troops and equipment. Another tactic used by the Serbs was to place damaged vehicles or equipment out in the open. Bombing the same pieces of equipment over and over again accounts for part of NATO's inaccurate estimates of Serb losses.
The Serbs, I think, have said that they would put damaged tanks out in the fields, put them out there, you know, tanks that had already been hit once, put them out so they got hit again. So there was a lot of double counting, who knows, triple counting.
NATO's early estimate of Serb casualties was also grossly inflated. Rather than 5 or 10,000, NATO peacekeepers now estimate that less than 1,000 Serbs were killed in combat. It is widely believed that the figure would have been even lower had NATO not coordinated its attacks in the final weeks of the campaign with the Kosovo Liberation Army, or KLA. The KLA, a guerrilla army of ethnic Albanian militants, is dedicated to Kosovo's independence from Serbia. The majority of Serb casualties in the air war are believed to have resulted from 2 American B-52 bomber attacks on Serb units which had been driven out into the open by KLA troops.
In order to really do some damage to these people, it did require a ground force. It just wasn't a NATO or a U.S. ground force. It was the KLA fighters that were forcing the Serbs to come out in the open and concentrate their forces and therefore make them better targets.
Ruling out the use of NATO ground forces in Kosovo is now viewed by many as a grave tactical error. It allowed the Serbs to enlarge their forces, adapt their tactics, and all but complete the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo. Charles Link argues that, perhaps worst of all, ruling out ground forces in Kosovo allowed Milosevic to think he could win.
If you have all the American expert testimony, public testimony, that this is probably not going to work, it probably induces an enemy who thinks there's a chance of a successful holdout to hold out longer.
In many ways, Milosevic's tactics were successful in the Kosovo War. He held the world's most potent military force at bay, while his own troops swept through Kosovo, brutalizing his enemies. Thus far, Milosevic has escaped any serious punishment for his aggression in Kosovo. And while the KLA has agreed to disarm, Milosevic has not. When his forces withdrew from Kosovo, they did so at near full strength.